Have you ever wondered how medieval peasants, lacking modern tools and materials, managed to build their houses from scratch? Strong, warm, and durable? This process was not just a craft, but a true art of survival under the constant threat of cold, hunger, and war. Today we will travel to the distant past to uncover the secrets of construction that have been passed down from generation to generation for centuries. If you are interested in history, survival, and the life of our ancestors, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any details from this amazing journey. When a peasant in the early Middle Ages chose a site for a future dwelling, he was not guided by the beauty of the view, but by the whispers of the earth and old beliefs. Water was a blessing, but also a curse. A stream too close threatened spring floods and plague miasmas in the heat. That is why they built not on the shore, but on the side, on an elevation where their feet would not get stuck and the water would not come to the threshold. The forests were dangerous, but they provided shelter from winds, a source of building materials and even food when hungry. The shade of the oak trees in the summer saved them from the sweltering heat, and the rare forest glades were the perfect compromise between safety and resources. The soil was tested with bare feet, sometimes breaking a clod of earth to feel its strength. If it was too clay, the house would float in the spring. An experienced peasant searched for a place where the soil was not damp, but kept cool. Such places were more often found where ancestors had settled before. If traces of an old hut were found, it was considered a good sign. Someone had already survived here, and the earth had accepted a tenant. There was a belief that the spirits of swamps and those who died in the water could return if a house was built too close to a shaky place. Therefore, they often cleared clearings near old roads or near places that were considered pure, sanctified, such as a holy grove or a cross. The northern walls of the houses were placed so that they sheltered from harsh winds, while the southern side received the winter sun. This knowledge was passed on not through books, but through observation. The smoke, the flight of birds, the way frost falls. It was believed that if in the morning the fog gathers to the east of the meadow, this place is good, alive. Proximity to the forest also meant protection from bandits. Dense thickets were a natural barrier to strangers and snooping warriors. Sometimes the whole village was moved after several harsh winters or fires, and the old place was left to not anger the earth. Surprisingly, even centuries later, archaeologists have found the remains of these settlements exactly where modern engineers would also approve development. The choice was not a matter of a single day. They could walk around for weeks, listening to the land, the wind, the beast. No one just built on a flat clearing. It did not stay flat without a reason. Often peasants spent the first nights in a tent or temporary hut, observing the behavior of animals and the weather on the site. Only then did they begin clearing and building, with blessings, caution, and always with a look back at old fears. After the peasant had chosen a suitable place, the hard and tedious work of clearing the site for the future house began. Saws were practically never used in the early Middle Ages. They were too rare, expensive, and unreliable in peasant life. Axes, hoes, shovels, and their own hands were used. Each tree was felled with an axe manually, blow by blow. The roots were pulled out with crowbars or burned if time was short. The smoke repelled insects and spirits, and the ash fertilized the soil. The earth was leveled with hoes and wooden shovels, and sometimes the holes were filled with stones and clay so that there were no holes. The peasants did not work alone. Help came from neighbors, relatives, and the whole village. It was customary to help each other when building. The elders would suggest where there might be underground water. Young people would dig, children would carry kindling. The labor turned into a kind of ritual. People chanted, sang, spat over their shoulders to ward off evil spirits and sickness. Special attention was paid to trees, which, according to tradition, looked into the house. They could not be cut down without a ritual. If a felled tree fell in the wrong direction, it was considered a bad omen, and they could even move the building a few steps to the side. The marking was done simply. No drawings, only instinct, eye gauge, and generations of proven steps. Sticks were hammered into the ground at the corners of the future hut, and a rope or rawhide belt was stretched between them to mark the walls. Sometimes the marking was done with feet. They literally walked the width of the wall, the length of the hut, and the future yard. For right angles, a simple triangle principle was used. 3 parts on one side, 4 on the other, and 5 on the diagonal. This technique was known in antiquity, but in the villages it was passed on as a family secret. Without formulas, just from hand to hand. The future hearth was marked in advance. Its place had almost sacred significance. It was the basis for the entire layout. A mound was left around the hearth so that the fire would not escape, and warm air would be evenly distributed throughout the hut. Sometimes the place for the stable was cleared first, and then for the house, so that the cattle would be close by and create additional warmth. If the terrain allowed, they tried to place the house a little to the south of the stable, so that the wind would not drive odors and dampness into the living space. It was considered important not to build at the intersection of animal paths. Otherwise, the house would be restless and the animals would become nervous. The marking ended with a symbolic action. The first wooden stake was hammered into the center of the future house. This was the point from which all future life began, and it was on this point that they often prayed or placed an underground amulet. Sometimes a coin, a chicken bone, or the lock of hair, anything that could scare away evil, was buried there. The earth on the cleared site long held the smell of sweat, wood, and ashes, and from that moment a new chapter began. The house had not yet been built, but it lived in the markings, in the axes, in the dirt under the fingernails, like a promise to be kept. The first houses in peasant life were rarely raised directly above the ground. Most often they started by digging a shallow pit. This was the birth of the half house, the oldest, most labor-intensive, but time-tested form of shelter from the cold and wind. Peasants knew that the ground below the surface gives a stable temperature and protects from frost better than any wall. Usually the hole was half the height of an adult, no deeper, so that it would not flood in the spring. They dug with wooden shovels and pointed sticks, helping themselves with buckets made of bark to carry the earth outside. The floor itself was left tamped, clay, sometimes with a layer of straw, sometimes simply rubbed with feet until it became as dense as stone. The deepening gave natural protection from drafts, allowed to stoke the hearth less often, and kept the heat inside longer. Even in summer, such a half-dwelling kept cool. The peasants said that the earth keeps you breathing underneath. The walls of the pit were immediately reinforced. Otherwise, the loose soil would collapse, especially after rain. Stakes, clay putty, woven vine shields, and sometimes just large clods of turf hammered into the slope were used. The techniques were simple but skillfully calculated. For example, the lower part of the wall was sloped so that the weight of the earth pressed downwards instead of inwards. Sometimes they used the method of baking. They covered the walls with clay and burned straw inside. The clay hardened and turned almost into pottery. The corners of the pit were strengthened separately. The thickest stakes were hammered in, and sometimes a stone was put there if it was found nearby. The roof rested on these supports, so that the correct laying of the foundation gave stability to the whole structure. Surprisingly, archaeologists find the remains of such semi-dwellings all over Europe, from Scandinavia to the Slavic lands. Sometimes, if the ground was too wet, instead of a pit, the top layer of turf was simply removed, leaving a deepened base. In this case, a high clay backfill was built around the edges, so that the water did not flow inside, but instead went down the gutters. Special attention was paid to the entrance. It was placed at an incline, with a bend, so that the cold air would not roll straight in. Some peasants even dug a shallow, cold trap in front of the entrance, a pit where the heavy night air would accumulate. All these tricks were not written down. They were passed down from father to son, in body, in hands, in habits, as a matter of course. Half-dwellings were not just temporary dwellings. Many people lived in them for years, strengthening them, building on them, adding a stable or a storehouse to them. Even when a real wooden house appeared, the old half-dwelling was not dismantled. It was turned into a cellar, a place for storage. It was said that it was where warmth lives, and for good reason. Even in winter, neither potatoes nor millet froze in these hollows. Some pits were lined inside with hides or coarse cloth, especially if the family was poor and could not afford a real roof right away. The house began with a pit, dark, damp, but warm, and from this piece of hollowed-out earth, a whole life began. To build a house, a peasant did not go to the city and buy planks. He went outside the neighborhood and went to the forest, to the fields, to the banks. Everything that came to hand, clay from the cliff, boulders, branches, fallen trees, old stumps, everything could become a part of the future dwelling. Straw was especially valued. After the harvest, it was collected carefully, not leaving a single stalk, because it served as both insulation and roofing material. Clay was taken where it tears hands. It was thick, heavy, without sand admixtures, often from ravines or dried-up creek beds. It was kneaded with feet all day long, mixed with straw and manure, and put into molds to make building bricks, the so-called saman. The wood was chosen according to its species and sound. Oak sounded muffled and heavy, while aspen sounded hollow and was considered a cursed tree. Aspen was associated with the evil power, with witches, and it was not used in the house even as a fire stove. They were afraid of attracting evil. But oak was a symbol of strength, firmness. It was used to make the main beams, piles, door jambs, and thresholds. Birch was used for flooring and partitions, spruce for ceiling beams, and alder was often used for interior paneling. When there was no choice, everything that grew was used, but the best wood was reserved for the load-bearing parts. The dried wood in the forest was valued more than freshly cut wood. It had less moisture, did not crack, and lasted longer. But if it was necessary to cut down a living tree, the tree was felled in the fall, when the sap was already gone, or at the beginning of winter, at the most lifeless time. After cutting the log, it was not sawed, but notched and placed vertically, so that the sap flowed down and dried through the bark. The logs were dried right on the plot. They were placed on stones raised above the ground to prevent them from drying out from below, covered with needles or rags. Sometimes they were even buried in the swamp for a month to expel resin and larvae, and then they were pulled out and dried again. Branches were gathered into bundles. They were used to weave walls and frame buildings, to make a so-called wattle and daub, or frame clay construction. Moss and lichen were plucked from trees. They served as a natural cushion between timbers, no worse than wool. The stones were chosen rounded. Sharp stones were difficult to embed. They cracked and fell out over time. Often even peat was used as a building material. It was used to make blocks for walls, especially in the northern regions. Everything from soaked reeds to old fishing nets was used, if it was necessary to insulate cracks or tie fragile parts. Gathering materials was not just physical labor. It was knowledge passed down through generations. The ability to see a house in a bush, in a boulder, in a tree. A neighbor could tell from the look of the timbers when and where they were cut, how they were preserved, and how many years they would last in a damp climate. Everyone knew that to build from unprepared raw materials would doom a house to rot, warp, and collapse in a year. Materials were never in abundance. Every stone, every knot mattered, and even clay was considered better or worse depending on its color. The peasants believed if a house was built from honestly obtained, properly selected materials, it would stand as a tree stands in the ground. When the basic materials were gathered and dried, the most important part began, the installation of the wooden frame. This was the skeleton of the whole house, its backbone on which the walls, roof, ceiling beams, and doors were attached. The work was strictly manual. No saws or nails were used, only an axe, a cleaver, and a hacksaw if there was one. In the villages of Europe, especially in England and northern France, there were whole dynasties of carpenters who knew the craft of timber framing by heart. Their task was not just to assemble the frame, but to calculate it for decades in advance, in conditions of dampness, winds, and seasonal distortions. All joints were made on the principle of tongue and groove, or dovetail, mortises, notches, locks, and not a single nail. To fasten the parts together, wooden wedges were used. They were hammered in with force, and as they shrank, they only clamped the joint more firmly. Sometimes cowhide or hemp ropes impregnated with resin were added. They did not rot and held the construction like steel reinforcement. The planks were adjusted to each other on the spot, applying and leveling them directly on the ground. Without drawings, everything was by eye and by experience. And if a carpenter made a mistake even by a finger, the whole construction could be skewed. That's why an old master was always respected above a blacksmith. The planks were leveled with an axe, not with a saw, leaving behind traces of rough but alive processing, like scars on wood. The less saws, the longer the wood lasts, so carpenters said, and they tried not to open the fibers unnecessarily. Even today, archaeologists can determine from these traces when the house was built, 17th or 13th century. So recognizable is the handwriting. The frame was put up alternately, first vertical posts, then cross beams, then horizontal dressings. The triangle principle was often used. Diagonal braces prevented the wall from folding due to wind or the weight of the roof. To lift the heavy beams, the whole village would gather. Strong men, teenagers, sometimes women with ropes. They used long pole, stanchions, rope blocks. One beam could weigh up to 100 kilograms. The place of fastening was treated with resin or beeswax to prevent the wood from swelling from moisture. The intersections were carved with the simplest symbols, a cross, a star, or a circle as a protection against destruction and fire. It was believed that if the first wedge went in at the first blow, the house would last at least 3 generations. Houses with such a frame, especially in Germanic and English villages, are still standing today, sewn under plaster or brick. It was the frame that formed the shape of the house. Its height determined whether there would be a second tier and how steep the roof would be. The walls inside the frame were then filled with wicker, adobe, stone, or planks, depending on the terrain. But it was the frame that held all the load, from the heavy roof to snow cover in winter and stormy winds in fall. When the wooden frame was ready and stood firmly on the ground, it was time to fill its inner openings. For this purpose, in each section, a living lattice, most often made of willow, hazel, or vines, was woven between the timbers. This was an ancient method known as far back as the Neolithic period, later called wattle, the foundation of the future wall. The branches were woven crosswise, alternating in flexibility and thickness, giving the whole structure elasticity and cohesion. The tighter and curvier the wattle, the better the clay was retained in it, and the more reliable it was for keeping heat. A mixture of clay, straw, manure, and ash was applied on top of the wattle, a mixture proven over centuries. This technology was called wattle and daub, and it was widely used in Europe until the 19th century. The composition was simple but effective. Straw provided a binder, ash provided insect protection, and manure provided plasticity and warmth. The clay was carried in buckets and mixed right in the yard on special clay pits dug underfoot. In the warm season, it was kneaded barefoot, standing up to the ankles by the whole family until it became sticky and viscous. Next came the dirtiest, but also the most fun part, applying the mass to the walls. The clay was thrown by hand, pounded in with wooden shovels, hammered into every bend of the wattle. The harder and sloppier it was applied, the stronger it held. Smooth walls cracked more often. After the first layer, they waited until everything dried a little. Then the second and third layers were applied like plaster. Sometimes the surface was smoothed with a stone or by hand, but more often it was left rough, so that it would be easier to renew it in spring. Walls made in this way could be as thick as 2 palms and retained heat better than any stone. No one was embarrassed by irregularities. No draft walked in them, and in summer such walls breathed, absorbing moisture. Sometimes lime whitewash or a mixture of lime was added on top to repel insects. In some regions, especially in Scandinavia and Bavaria, moss or bark was added to the clay to increase protection against mold. Over time, the wall would take on a grayish-beige hue, cracked but strong, like old earth. Such houses, despite their simplicity, stood for decades if the roof did not leak. The clay layer could be repaired by hand. A fresh mixture was applied on top, and everything was kept as new again. Sometimes in spring, they organized renewal of walls. Children kneaded new clay. Women slapped it with their hands. Men strengthened the corners. Inside, such walls breathed. In the heat, they remained cool. In the frost, they did not let in damp. And the main thing, the house was built from what was underfoot, cost almost nothing, and was kept on the strength of the family and the craft of the village. When the walls were finished, it was time for the most important part of the house, the roof, without which it was not worth even moving in. In most European villages, straw was used for the roof, a light, affordable, but capricious material. It was strictly prepared in late summer, when the grain had already been harvested and the stalks had not yet been soaked by the fall rains. Only long, unbroken straw was chosen, wheat or rye, less often oats because they held their shape worse. It was tied in small sheaves, dried under a shed, not in the sun. Otherwise, it lost flexibility and broke. The rafter structure was made at an angle of at least 45 degrees, so that water did not stagnate and roll down quickly. Bundles of straw were laid on wooden pole, starting from the bottom, like scales, so that each upper row overlapped the lower one. They were fastened by hand, tightly pulling them to the crossbars with ropes, vines, or wooden wedges. The bigger the overlap and the tighter the laying, the better the roof held and the less chance it had of leaking in the spring. It took up to 400 sheaves for the whole roof. The whole village worked if the family could not cope on its own. Roofs made of thatch breathed, retained heat, and at the same time served for a surprisingly long time, up to 15-20 years with good care. But in almost every village there was a rule. In spring, the roof was inspected, repaired, and everything that was blown away by the wind was finished. The dirt, clay, and ashes from the kiln would rise up into the ceiling, so the bottom layer of thatch would darken and settle faster. Sometimes the bottom part was simply removed and replaced, leaving the top. This was called freshening the roof. Straw protected not only from rain, but also from heat. Under such a roof in the height of summer, it was cooler than in the shade of a tree. And in winter, it became a real insulator. The snow lay on top, without falling through, forming an additional layer. In some regions, such as Normandy and East Anglia, thatched roofs covered entire estates, not just peasant huts. The roof could bloom with moss or even grass. This was not considered a bad sign, but on the contrary, testified to tightness. Fires, of course, were a problem. In dry summers, one spark from a stovepipe could destroy the whole yard, so the roof was cleaned. In some villages, they kept special roofers, craftsmen who only dealt with thatch. They knew how to lay it correctly, what angle to make under the winds, how to weave drainage ears. There were also decorative elements, woven crests, bird figures on the ridge, amulets against evil spirits and lightning. The ridge of the roof was made especially carefully. The densest sheaves went there. Otherwise, water seeped inside the house. Over the years, the roof settled, darkened, but did not lose its main quality. It breathed with the house, and yet everyone who lived under a thatched roof knew it should not be abandoned. In spring, it means to fix, in autumn, to check, and in heavy rain, to listen to the drops running down it without penetrating inside. Straw didn't just cover from the weather, it connected the house with the earth, with the rhythm of the fields, with the harvest, with the hands that knitted it. So the roof became a living part of the house, which spoke more about the household than everything else. And if it was dry on top, then everything else could be tolerated. In the very center of the dwelling, on the compacted clay, the hearth was laid out, the place around which all life revolved. It was open, no stove, no brick furnace, just a heap of stones around which people gathered in the evening. Firewood was brought in the morning, if the forest allowed, and dried under a canopy or on the wall of the house, so that it would burn at least a little in the damp. The creaking fire was light, warmth, and protection. On particularly cold nights, shoes, rags, even bread were dried over the coals. It was by the hearth that people ate, told stories, warmed their children, and thawed from the fall dampness. There was a lot of smoke, because there was no chimney in the usual sense. They left a hole in the roof, a little closer to the ridge. A rough one, without flaps, sometimes just a gap in the thatch. The smoke escaped through it, but not all of it. The rest hung in the air, settled on the beams, got into hair and clothes. The ceiling above the hearth gradually turned black. The earthen beams charred and smelled of smoke, which was normal. Moreover, the soot was believed to protect the wood from insects and moisture, and the walls from mold. An open hearth required caution, especially in homes with children and animals, who were often kept inside. Small wooden fences, benches, or baskets protected the fire from accidental falls, but not always successfully. In many parts of Europe, especially in Germanic and Slavic lands, the hearth was not touched even when rebuilding a house. It was taboo. It was believed that the hearth was the heart of the dwelling, the altar, and to move it meant to bring bad luck. The fire was not completely extinguished at night. Smoldering embers covered with ashes were left to rekindle the heat in the morning. Over time, closer to the late Middle Ages, the first real chimneys began to appear in some regions. They were made of wood covered with clay or of wicker fired to charcoal, but they were still rare. There was no such luxury in an ordinary peasant hut. No chimney, no damper, not even a hood. They lived in smoke, lived in soot, and got used to it because there was no choice. And wood and clay are not stone. They do not catch smoke. Even in England, it was only by the 14th or 15th centuries that mass construction with stone chimneys began, and only for the wealthy. The hearth smoked, but it also kept the heat. The clay walls kept the heat, especially if the house was well insulated with straw. Many peasants deliberately did not make windows to retain heat and not let the smoke out too quickly. The soot was on the walls, the ceiling, the utensils, but it created a special atmosphere, gloomy, viscous, but alive. And yet it was a living smoke, not from the factory chimney, but from dry spruce chips, oak logs, pine lapnicks. It smelled of forest, bark, damp earth, and no matter how hard it was to breathe, it was part of home, part of life. The floor in a peasant house was not a separate element, but a part of the land itself. It was not built or laid. It was tamped down with feet, pounders, and wide planks. In especially damp places, large stones or rubble were placed so that the feet would not get stuck in the mud after rain. A layer of clay was again laid on top of the stones, sometimes with ash or straw to make the floor denser and drier. Every spring it was renewed, a new layer, a new tamping. Otherwise, the floor started to dust and crack. At one end of the hut, they almost always kept domestic animals, especially in winter. A cow, a sheep, sometimes a pig and a chicken. All these lived literally a few meters away from the person. The animals were not spared, but they were not separated by a blank wall. They simply put a partition made of poles, wattles, and sometimes a trough. An animal in the house provided manure, a little warmth and security. A barking dog or a braying goat could scare away a thief. There was no distance between man and livestock. There was coexistence from year to year in winter and summer. The living part, closer to the hearth, had a primitive but functional layout. Along the walls, clay benches, ledges as wide as a body on which sheepskin or straw was placed. There were no mattresses, at most a bale of straw, rags, animal skin, sometimes just an old jacket. The whole family slept on these bunks, shoulder to shoulder, with the children at their side, the younger ones against the wall, and the older ones at the edge. The center of the room was left free. Here they cooked food, dried clothes, knitted and worked. Sometimes ropes or poles were stretched under the ceiling to dry herbs, hay, clothes, and amulets. Furniture was primitive, a table, just a board on stumps, benches, hollowed out logs, a chest. That's all. Wealth was not hidden. There were none. They kept everything in plain sight. Clay pots, sacks of cereals, iron hooks. And if someone died in the house, it happened here, by the hearth, on the same bunks. In winter, the floor was often wet, especially if animals trampled on it or a drip from the roof. Sometimes straw was put on the floor, sometimes it was just tolerated. They walked barefoot on the damp clay day after day. In spring, they renewed it. The old layer was chipped off, fresh clay was added, and the whole family stomped on it. It is believed that such floors were preserved in the villages of Eastern Europe until the 19th century. In England, they were replaced by wooden floors only in the homes of craftsmen, and even then in the cities. Dust was part of life, as was soot and the stench of cattle. But the clay floor was warm when summer sat in it, and strong when it had been trampled over generations. Even in the king's halls, there was not always such a connection to the earth. Direct, rough, but secure. Here one lived without fear of falling, the ground doesn't hurt. Here they were born, fed, prayed, and died. And even though everything was cramped, dark, and smelled like a stable, it was home. A home where everything was held together by clay and patience. The roofs of medieval peasant houses were vulnerable to gusts of wind and thunderstorms, so to prevent them from tearing, bundles of straw were fastened very tightly, and sometimes heavy stones or wooden planks were laid on top, which served as a kind of clamps. Sometimes the owners tied ropes around the roof, fastening them to the frame timbers, and after particularly severe storms, the entire roofing material was inspected and, if necessary, repaired by hand, which became an annual spring tradition. This meticulous care allowed the roof to last a long time and the house to stay warm and dry, even during the heavy rains and strong winds that often plagued medieval villages. Wattle and daub walls were not very strong on their own, so to protect them they were covered with a mixture of lime and water, and sometimes with the addition of fine sand. This solution not only strengthened the surface, but also protected against rot and mold, and helped reflect sunlight, which reduced the heating of the house in the summer. Lime whitewashing was also a way to deter insects and some small rodents that tried to settle in the soft clay, and the procedure of applying lime was accompanied by a kind of rituals because it was believed that it brings protection and prosperity to the house. Historical documents from the 13th and 14th centuries describe that lime was extracted from neighboring quarries and carefully processed to get the right consistency, and then the family would help the whole community apply it to the walls. It was a moment of unity and teamwork. The fence around the yard played an important role. Most often it was a wattle of young branches, which separated the living space from fields, roads, and forests, protecting from wild animals and prying eyes. And sometimes shallow ditches were dug around the fence, serving to drain rainwater and an additional barrier to entry. A guard dog was often kept inside the yard. Its barking warned of the approach of strangers or predators, and the dog itself became not only a guard, but also a companion of the family's life, able to track down danger in the darkness of the night. Medieval chronicles and folklore tell many stories about how, thanks to such a set of measures, peasants saved their houses and livestock from uninvited guests and natural disasters. Thus, home defense was a multi-step process involving not only physical measures, but also certain traditions and rituals designed to keep the family safe. Each element, from heavy roof stones to fences and ditches, had its own function and together created a solid fortification system that allowed people to live and work in the changing and sometimes harsh nature of medieval Europe. Understanding these details shows how thoughtful and vital each stage of the construction and defense of the peasant house was, which was not just a dwelling, but a real fortress for the family. Every element in the construction of a medieval house, from the choice of location to the reinforcement of the roof, was thought out and honed by the experience of many generations. These houses were not just shelter, but real fortresses that protected families from the elements and enemies. Understanding these ancient techniques helps us feel more deeply connected to history and appreciate the incredible ingenuity of our ancestors. Thank you for being with us on this dive into the past, and if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to discover more secrets of medieval life together.